Today I'm going to show you how I made this dress, the Vogue Patterns V8577. The pattern requires an average of 7.5 metres fabric depending on the size, but I managed to make it out of just 3 metres. I'll show you how to change your pattern by removing the lining and creating a facing instead. This method will work on any pattern you have, not just this one. As with any pattern, I began by tracing my size, in this case grading down a few sizes as the pattern was too large. I made a toile and carried out my common fit adjustments of reducing the length in the back and narrowing the shoulders. I did feel the bodice was still quite a loose fit for my style, but I didn't want to unbalance the volume of the skirt, so I left it. Looking back now, I think I could have got away with reducing the size further, but I will do this if I make the pattern again. Once I had my pattern pieces set, I could then make my facing from them. You will need all pieces that form the front edge for this. I made a quick sketch of the pattern to show you as an example. I did forget the waistband, but it's the same process you use for this pattern or any pattern you have. Start by marking the seam lines on all sections where they will connect to each other. Starting from the centre back, begin to trace out the neckline shape. You don't need the whole piece, just the area on the edge you want the facing for. Ensure you copy over that seam line. Follow the front edge and trace the next pattern piece, in this case the front bodice. Ensure though that you connect the seam lines, not the pattern edges, but a line where the seam will connect. Again, mark the seam line at the next edge, ready to connect the next piece. On this example, it is the skirt front. You will need to do the waistband front and then the skirt front for the Vogue pattern. Just follow that front edge until you hit the hem. To finish the facing, you want a depth of about 2.5 inches. So draw a smooth curve and then straight line, following the shape of that front edge. Label your pattern piece facing, add any notches or grain lines. You will need to cut 2 of these in your main fabric and 2 interfacing, joining at the centre back. Now this pattern piece is large. Large parts can be harder to cut from your fabric efficiently. Since this is a facing and is unseen, you could split this up into smaller sections and add seam allowances to connect them. Here is an example of how to split this up with a back neck facing, bodice facing and skirt facing. You will connect these all together and work with them as you would had you cut it a full piece. So here we have halved our fabric requirements and swapped the front bottom band for a facing that will take up relatively the same space on the main fabric. At this point I selected my fabric and I picked a simple viscose crepe polka dot in black and white. The reason I went for this is the properties of the fabric in the grain is identical in the cross grain. That means that I can place my pattern horizontal instead of just vertical. Secondly, the print is not directional or requires any matching. That means I can squeeze them as close as possible without thinking about how they line up. I ignored the lay plan given and played pattern Tetris to see where I was at. To my shock, it seemed to fit already without any more changes. I cut it folded horizontally, then I did some folded on the vertical. And finally, I cut the last pieces flat, including the bias binding for the sleeve edge. I also cut interfacing for the pocket fronts and the facing I made. If you're doing this for yourself, I would also recommend cutting interfacing for your waistband front and back. I didn't, and I regret it now, and I will show you why at the end. The construction of this followed the pattern mostly, so I won't go into detail here. The only adaptation I made is I now had to address all my raw edges as I went because there was no lining to hide it within. I overlocked every edge. You could do this or you use a zigzag stitch on your regular machine or whatever method you prefer. I do have a video on seam finishes which is available here. Another sewing tutorial video you may wish to check out is how to form darts. The links for these and any mentioned will be in the description. I will also link to any materials I have used. I wish I had followed my instinct when constructing this and left the side seams to be sewn up last. It would have allowed me to really slim down and adjust that fit as a final step to my preference. I followed the pattern though, and I'm not sure why, but that's something I would change next time. The sheer weight in this skirt is unbelievable, and this is a light fabric. I saw online a lady had made this in a gorgeous red linen that I almost went for, and I'm really glad I didn't now because I can't imagine the heaviness. It's a full skirt. Now this is the reason why I wish I had interfaced the waistband, simply to help support this weight. Had I kept the lining layer, this would have had 2 layers to support, but also it would have held up another full skirt layer. So even if I was to sew this as explained in the pattern, I would still add interfacing to create that support at the waistband. A lot of people are excited by the pockets when they first see this pattern, and it's no wonder because they are huge. The instructions are really good and they are really secure when constructed and complete. It is quite nerve-wracking to cut your fabric to accommodate them curves as you sew. You always have the worry that if you have gone wrong, you can't always go back if you have cut. I cut whilst at my machine a minimal amount to just get that smooth edge with no puckers or tucks along it. I repeated this for attaching the pocket band to the skirt front and then connecting the inner pocket front to them in a sandwich motion. This is the stage where the skirt and bodice section are joined. If you wanted to reduce fabric consumption on this make, a change you could make is to remove all this gathered section from the centre back skirt panel. To do that, you would measure your back waistband bottom edge. Take away the back side skirt measurement and then remove the extra from the centre back skirt measuring from the fold line in. You want to maintain the straight line at the centre back to maintain your grain lines. Once the bodice and skirt were attached together, I then started with the facing. The first thing I did was join it at the centre back, pressing the seam open and finishing it on the overlocker. I also overlocked the whole exterior edge to prevent fraying. I then aligned this to the neckline, right sides together, matching the crucial points. The stay stitching done at the beginning keeps the neckline from being stretched out during construction. This is where you would notice that if you skip that step. Your front neckline would likely be longer now than your facing, as it was cut almost on the bias and it would have stretched out of shape. I stitched from the centre back to the hem on each side in turn with a 5/8 seam allowance. I then snipped the curves and the corners where the neck changes to the centre front edge. I finished the raw edge and I understitched round. Understitching is to keep the facing on the reverse side and help create a neat edge when pressing. You can leave your facing like this, but I prefer to tack it down in areas to prevent it turning out. First, I stitched in the ditch on all the seam lines. So that is the centre back, shoulder, waistband top and bottom. I also did a herringbone stitch around the back neck curve. I find securing this area really locks it all in place without needing to do it all. You could do all if you wish though. This way it is completely invisible on the right side of the garment. Applying the bias binding to the armhole was fiddly because of the small size and the drape of the fabric, but it went on with lots of pins to help. It was also easier because instead of having the lining, I was only binding one layer. By hand stitching to finish, you can see it leaves a completely invisible finish on the outer side of the garment, which is lovely. At this point, I placed my garment onto my dress form and left it to hang for 24 hours. It really dropped, as you can see, which I expected given the fullness and the weight of the skirt. Because it dropped so much, I decided to leave it another day just to be completely sure it had settled. I completed the hem by levelling it out, finishing the raw edge and turning it up by 1 centimetre. I hand stitched it to finish, which took so long. The length of this hem is a lot. I stuck on a podcast and just worked through it. I really find hand stitching your hems on a circle skirt is worth the extra time and effort, as it eliminates the rolling and warping you sometimes get on a machine. I never use the button guide given in the pattern. I don't even stick to the sizes and numbers suggested. I wear the garment and decide using pins where I need closing points for the strain points on my body. Once decided, I then mark the outline of this overlap with pins to use as a guide whilst I'm working. You don't usually need to do all the way down the dress. Just focus on the top edge as this is the visually important point. Then measure this distance down to the hem. Another tip I always have to remind myself to do is never begin buttonholes with an important one. So the top one, which will be the most visible, or the waistband one that is going to take the most strain. The reason is, if you've set up your machine incorrectly, or just not anticipated a problem that occurs in your actual garment compared to your practice ones, then it's a blaringly obvious mistake. Unpicking a buttonhole is possible, but it often marks the fabric and is unsightly. Start with one that is not going to be seen easily and smooth out any issues. Now you're more confident you will have a success, work your way through them all. I like to hand stitch buttons, and I always begin with point crossing like the waistband or top buttonhole. So here is the finished dress. The pattern has a lovely, relaxed, comfortable feel. Going into winter, I will layer long sleeve tops below. The bodice is looser than I usually wear, but a belt looks well. Now, if I had constructed this by doing the side seams last from armpit to hem, I would have tightened the bodice by fitting it whilst on my body and testing the movement I had. The other adaptation I would make is to deal with the warping the weight in the skirt is causing on the waistband. As you can see, it is dragging it out of shape along the seam. This is why I recommend interfacing the waistband sections if you make this dress for yourself. I am going to address this problem by making some alterations before I wear it, but this video is already quite long. I'll probably do a follow-up in a few weeks showing you the solutions to this. When you sew, especially working with a new pattern, it's easy to overlook simple fixes at the early stages when you are planning everything out. Even with experience, sometimes you don't spot potential problems that at the end you realise are quite obvious. If you want to see that video or any more of my sewing content, please hit subscribe to stay notified. Otherwise, consider hitting the like button if you have enjoyed today's video, and happy sewing!